Well, Dr. Gooden, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to see you.
I'm happy to be here. Good to see you again.
Before we jump into, I have a ton of questions I want to ask you, but if you could just briefly say who you are and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I am a licensed clinical psychologist and self-worth coach and speaker and author. So at the core of my work is helping people to embrace the fact that they are unconditionally worthy so they can show up and thrive and share their gifts with the world. And I do that in my clinical practice and my coaching practice through individual and group coaching programs. And then I also love to do it with speaking and podcast guesting and that sort of thing.
One of the ways that you came to my attention was you were on Insight Timer and there was a talk that you did there, and then that led me to your profile, and then I saw you did a TED talk about your journey. So without having to, regurgitate all of those things that you've done and do your TED talk all over again, could you just say a little bit about the early steps of your evolution and your journey into your career?
That's a good question. I think in some ways the origins of my career are as a kid, always being curious about people, always being interested in people. I've always been a people person, and I've also struggled with fitting in and struggled with not feeling good enough and wanted to help people and sort of over-indexed on doing too much of that. And so I think that's sort of like the personal origins of it. And then, so this is always an interesting tidbit, both of my parents are clinical psychologists. So I also had these models and my parents were mostly academics. So they went sort of the academic route, but they also had clinical practices. So I had that as a model of possibility. And then, when I came through college, I was like, yeah, I like this psychology thing. So I decided to pursue that. And then getting more specifically into the self-worth piece, which is what I talked about in my TEDx talk, part of what I realized is that I was really struggling with trying to prove my worth through academics, through relationships, through friendships, like all these things, all these external attempts to prove my worth. And this really came to a head for me when I passed my dissertation defense. And you'd think that would be like this ultimate, accomplishment and career achievement. But I walked out of that room, slumped into a chair and started sobbing because it was immediately apparent to me that wasn't going to make me feel worthy, that it hadn't worked, right? Like all the overworking, all the overextending, all the pushing for this ultimate goal that was supposed to make me feel worthy hadn't worked, right? And that really prompted me to look inward and to look elsewhere beyond the achievements and the accomplishments for my sense of worth. And so I went on that journey. And then when I was working with high achievers, I was working at a university, one of the top universities in the country, and I was working with high achievers and saw that they were having the same problem, right? Like the same challenge. These are brilliant students. They get into this top school and they still feel unworthy. And I realized then that this wasn't a me problem. It wasn't singular to me. It was something that resonates with a lot of people. And that's really what inspired me to give the TEDx talk and really do this work, because I believe that everyone has gifts to share. I believe that everyone's worthy. And I believe that the world will be a better place when more people know that that's true about themselves, so that they can get on with the work they want to do in the world, with what they want to share, without that baggage of trying to prove that they're worthy.
Prior to college, let's say when you're growing up in high school, when you're figuring out so you didn't necessarily want to be a psychologist when you were in high school, even though you had those models. Was there anything else that you were thinking that you would end up doing as a career?
That's a good question. There were times when I was like, well, maybe I'll be a lawyer because I like to debate. I like to kind of argue, you know what I mean? Like argue a point. But I sort of have always jokingly said that I am not like a big hopes and dreams person, which it's like a weird thing to say for somebody who went to Stanford and got my PhD before I was 30, right? But I am not like I'm going to do this in 10 years. Like, this is the plan. This is the master plan. I'm always inspired and impressed by people who are like that, but that's not how I am. So when I was in high school, I was not I didn't have I don't remember what my answer would have been if somebody was like, well, what do you want to be? What do you grow? I really actually can't connect to what my answer would have been. And it wasn't until the summer before my senior year of of college that I had this conversation with my dad about like what I liked, what I wanted to do. And he was like, okay, you should look into psychology. And I was like, okay, I will. I knew I was already majoring in psychology, but I still didn't know at that point that I wanted to be a psychologist. And my parents are very hands off. So they're not like, you should do this, right? Like that's not their style. So it wasn't until like middle end of college that I was like, okay, like I'll try to be a psychologist. Like that makes sense.
Were there other moments? Because you mentioned when you got to the point you're like this, you didn't feel fulfilled. Is that fair to say? Okay.
Yeah.
Were there were there other points along your journey where those things where when you were trying to reach for this or trying to do that, that you got smaller pieces of that feeling?
That's a good question. I mean, I did like this internship in college that was, somewhat of like, I don't know if it's prestigious, like it wasn't like management consulting, but it was like a competitive internship. And I was working with a foundation. And, that was like the most impressive summer thing I did. And I liked it, but it wasn't fulfilling. But that's because for me, the way I like helping people is like seeing the people that I help. Like I like more face-to-face, more active, more like I can see the transformation. I can see the light bulbs, all of those things. And that was far away. That was like, okay, what's this grant and what's this granting organization doing and all of those things. So I think there were those things, but I don't know if I would say I wasn't fulfilled along the way. I think what happened was there were a lot of things that I was doing that I would enjoy. Like I loved being a therapist and in training. I loved learning. There was a lot of things I loved, but the idea that the goal was going to fulfill me and the goal was going to be the thing that made me feel worthy, that's where the lack of fulfillment came. So thankfully I was on a path that was generally a good fit. Now, I think there are a lot of folks who get on paths that aren't a good fit because their parents want them to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or, whatever, right? Classic for children of immigrants, like there's often that pressure, right? But so thankfully I wasn't on a career. Like if I had tried to be chemist, like, first of all, I don't think I would have made it, but you know what I mean? Like that would have felt unfulfilling because it would have been so off of what I did. And thankfully what I do is really aligned. It's just how I go about it now is different than when I was orienting towards, I got to be the best. I got to do the best. I got to get the goal. And it's like this end point versus what's the process? What's my experience all along the way? And that's really what makes it fulfilling.
Now, as you're dealing with this in your personal life, and then it becomes something that you're working through with, your education and then to your career, again, it's called tools, talents, and techniques. Are there certain techniques that you've used then and have evolved? Is there any consistent theme of techniques, or are these always kind of evolving in your view?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the techniques I was using in my younger years needed to evolve because they were not great and they were not sustainable, right? Like, I think a technique I used was like, using anxiety to like keep myself pushing and going, right? And like using self-criticism to like keep myself moving and going, right? Like, and I think that's a technique or a strategy, I would say kind of an unhelpful strategy in the long term of a lot of high achievers, of a lot of type A people to like push, 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 push. And obviously it got me somewhere, but ultimately it's not sustainable, right? So, where I used to be self-critical and really harsh when I made a mistake and all of those things and like push myself, beyond my limits, not rest, not nourish my body. Like when I used to do that and that did get me a measure of success, now it looks like self-compassion and with accountability, right? So like being kind and compassionate to myself, but also taking accountability of like, what's mine to fix? Where did I misstep? What did I do wrong? Right. And I actually think that that's a much more sustainable way, or, doing good work, but not overworking myself so that I can get enough time for rest and sleep. And that's actually more sustainable. And what I have found is as I have shifted. I'm happier. I am more fulfilled. I also make more money. Like I work less and I make more money. Like it just works better than when I'm like when I was in the overwork, overextend, hypercritical thing that I think a lot of high achievers operate in, and I did for years, but it was time to let that go.
That's a fantastic answer. One of the things that I want to bring you back to on that are, now that you know that and those techniques or those strategies are not useful, is there anything that you have or you use or you do that you use these moments as guideposts, like where you can feel yourself going that direction or feel that you say, hold on, wait a minute, I'm doing that thing again? Is that a thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are certainly times when self-criticism pops up, right? Self-judgment, self-doubt. And, I think that's okay. I think that's normal and human. But now I'm able to catch it and just like offer myself some compassion, and say like, it's okay, right? Like it's okay to feel the way you are feeling. It's okay to be anxious or scared or whatever. And like, it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. If you did something wrong, I can fix it, right? Like so it might crop up like, oh, why'd you do that? Or like, oh, but I try to pretty quickly. And because I've been practicing it for years, I am able to recognize it and interrupt it pretty quickly. The question also brings to mind like what it was like for me when I first like launched my business and started working for myself. And part of the thing that I wanted to get away from that was like a dynamic in my last job was this culture of chaos and anxiety and urgency that was just like not necessary and very stressful. But what I found when I first was like working for myself is that I was recreating that culture, right? Like I was creating deadlines and like, doing this thing to like do all this stuff. But the thing was, I worked for myself, so I couldn't blame anybody else. Like I couldn't be like, oh, my boss is awful and blah, blah, blah. Like it was just like, oh, that's me. Like literally nobody else is doing this to you but you. And so that's a place where I had to really say, okay, if I want this to feel different, I have to do something different. I have to make different like I have to not overwork, overcrowd, overstuff my schedule. And over the last 3 years of working for myself, that's been a gradual ongoing process of shifting out of some of these norms and rhythms that were just chaotic and stressful and dysregulating, but I had gotten used to. So that's kind of another place where I've had to make that shift.
When I looked at your profile and going through some of the information that you have and some of the things that you talk about a lot, there's some words that pop out: imposter syndrome, procrastination, confidence, boundaries, stress and anxiety. Are there things that you're seeing more and more in your clients or the people that you work with? Like in the order of, I guess if there's a pie chart, like where do you see that you're spending the most time focusing on?
That's a really good question. I think it's a range. I think that there's like imposter syndrome pops up, but in sort of interesting ways, like not always the classic, like, I don't feel like I deserve to be here, but sometimes it's like, ooh, like, what if I shine? What if and I have a coaching client where we really are digging into the roots and the origins of his imposter syndrome and how what connects to childhood and how he can show up differently and like all of those things, which is a really fun thing to work through. But certainly the stress, the anxiety, the boundaries, like, I think that's really big. One, because we're in a social political moment that's very stressful, right? The economy is very stressful, right? Like there are just some things in our world right now that can be very stressful, and, people are getting laid off. Like there's just so much stuff that actually, causes people stress. So that's often coming through. And then boundaries, because I think, boundaries are perpetual challenge, right? Like especially boundaries with work, right? People are having more conversations with boundaries in personal life, but then also it's like, what does it look like to set boundaries at work so that you're not overworking all the time and feel like you always have to be on and those sorts of things. So I would say those are some of the themes that tend to come through. But it may look, like the shape and the feel of it may be a little bit different depending on which client and what we're talking about specifically.
Sure. That leads me, because you work with individuals and then you also work with companies and organizations as well. And so this question isn't really like this or that, but and it could be both. Perhaps it is both. It probably is both. Do you get more of an impact, like the results from working with the individual or rather the organization? Is this top down or is this bottom up? Like, where do you see it having the biggest impact for working with people?
That's a really good question. Often, so when I'm working with organizations, often I'm doing like a talk or a workshop for an event, or a retreat or something like that. And so I would say my impact when I am, speaking at an organization is broad, right? So I sort of like get to be in front of more people hear this message, people are feeling inspired and, like getting some strategies to make some change. And so it's sort of like a broad impact. And then when I'm working with small groups in group coaching or individuals, it's like more of a deep impact because we're going from that sort of inspirational, like, okay, how do you shift your mindset into like, how do you really deeply integrate this into your life, right? Like, how do you actually start doing different things? Because I think, we've all read a self-help book. We've all listened to the podcast where it sounds really good. You're like, I'm all on board. That sounds great. I'm going to start doing it tomorrow. And then it just like doesn't translate. And so part of what we work on in the coaching is like, what are the barriers, right? Like, because my training as a psychologist really helps me to understand here's what actually gets in the way of change and how do we work with and through that such that you can really integrate some of these new ways of showing up, living, doing your work, etc. So yeah, I would say it's sort of like, is it a broad impact, like a lot of people, or is it like a deeper impact where it's like, we're really getting some integration and some transformation?
I love that. And one of the things that when you're working with these workshops and maybe this is for you as an individual as well, or the people that you work with, go to the tools part of this. Are there anything that you recommend? You said podcast, you mentioned, some other things. I hear meditation a lot is something that people use, but is there a common theme that you're recommending for different tools that people use? Apps, the technology maybe, but maybe timeless things like meditation. Like what do you see out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I do recommend meditation. I like Insight Timer because I use it. Some of my content's on there. I tend to talk a lot about self-compassion because I think that I talk about sort of compassion generally, like self-compassion and then offering compassion to others, because I think it's a really actionable framework for how we can start to treat ourselves better and how we can start to treat other people better. So briefly, I talk about self-compassion in a little bit of a different way, kind of call it a remix. But I sort of encourage people to think about 4 core phrases, which are I see you, which is really about how do you tune into yourself and see yourself, right? Like so often we're rushing, we're busy, we're not even paying attention to how do I feel physically, mentally, emotionally, right? So just like I see you. Can you see yourself? I accept you without judgment, right? Like I shouldn't feel this way. I should feel, right? Like just can you offer yourself some acceptance for wherever you are right now? Then I affirm you, which is offering some encouragement. Like, it's okay. Like, this is rough. This is tough. This is challenging. You're doing the best you can. It's okay. And then I care for you, right? Like, what's one thing you could do to care for yourself? And those same 4 phrases, I see you, I accept you, I affirm you, and I care for you, can be used with someone else, with a colleague, with a partner, with a child, right? Like to show up for them in a way that is compassionate. So that's a strategy that I'm often sharing and talking about because I think it's memorable and actionable and helps people to start to shift how they're relating to themselves and how they're relating to each other to have more positive relationship with themselves and relationship with other people. And my belief is that those things, how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to other people, are really the foundation of our well-being in the world.
I love that. And one of the things that I've heard before is that compassion is it's like love in action, right? It's like an actionable, it's like a verb in a way of love. But as far as like these mantra, if you will, or this, what you're saying, do you recommend people write this down? Is this a journaling exercise? Is this look in the mirror? Is this like how does that work in practice?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do have a free guide that I'm happy to share with your listeners if people are interested, and I can give you the link.
And I will
Because it is,
I will share all your contact information and everything
yes,
on the show notes. So yeah, no problem.
perfect. So I think it is helpful to write it down and to use the phrases as guideposts, right? So like, I see you is like, okay, what do I see? Well, like, how am I doing right now, right? And then I accept you. Can I accept it without judgment? Just to like, it's sort of like a practice. You could do it as a meditation. I have a guided meditation on Insight Timer. That's a self-compassion practice. It could be just a daily check-in, right? Like, what do I see? Where am I at? Can I accept that? Like, how do I offer acceptance? How do I encourage myself? And what's one thing I can do to care for myself? So it could be sort of a guide for here's how you practice self-care, how you check in with yourself, how you tune in. It could be a meditation, right? So there's a number of different forms that could take just depending on what resonates. It could be journaling prompts, right? For people who really like to journal. Yeah.
One of the things that in your journey, and even though you said like you didn't have an idea, but you were going this way, and you know you're doing this, and you've had you've had a lot of success in what you're doing, is now that you look back on your journey, and I'm not talking about regret, I'm talking about if there's something that you think if you could have zigged, you would have zigged instead of zagged during the time. Is there anything that you feel like you would have done sooner or earlier now that you know everything that you know?
That's a good question. I mean, the things that I would have done different, to be honest, is like have more fun. Like,
yeah, okay, I like that.
I just like had more fun in college. Like, I had a lot of fun in college. I had a great experience, but I was also like very serious and intense and in all the clubs and in all the blah, blah, blah. Like, one of the smartest things though that I did in college is that I had enough credits to finish a quarter early. And so I did not take classes my like spring quarter senior year. And I called it like Camp Stanford because it was like, I was on campus, I was living on campus. And I worked a part-time job and I just like had fun. So that was like, I'm like, wow, like I was wise at like 22 to 21, 22, however old I was to like take a break. But I think when I think about regrets, I think you should have just gone on that trip. Like you should have just, you know what I mean? Instead of sometimes like my index is like to be more responsible, like overly responsible. And I think that I wish that I just enjoyed the journey more, had more fun, like worried less about, you know, like making mistakes or not getting everything right. Because I think that when we were overly like perfectionistic, worried about mistakes, all of those things, like we want to be conscientious, but when we're overly doing that, we avoid things that bring us joy and aliveness and vibrance, right? Because there is risk in putting yourself out there. There's risk in playing full out and doing all the things you'd love to do because you're risk of rejection, risk of messing up, all of those things. But that's actually what makes life worth living. So yeah, I think the biggest thing I would tell my younger self is like, chill, sit back, relax. Like it's all going to work out. Like, yes, work hard, work intensely, but like have fun, play, take it less seriously, like just enjoy this, be a little less responsible. Like that would be the thing that I would recommend.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is trusting yourself. You know, that's what I hear about that. Like it's gonna work out. Trust yourself. You got this, and that's fantastic. You know, you also my next question you answered part of it, and I'd like to hear you elaborate on the things that you did right. That when you said you had the credits to graduate a semester early, was there anything else that in your path that you were like, I'm so glad I did this, or oh, that was not a lucky break, but man, that was fortuitous that I did this or that?
You cut out there for a second. I think we're back. So let's see some of the things I
sorry.
did.
Did we glitch? Sorry about that.
I think we're back. So the question is things I did right, right?
Yeah. Are there things that you were not luck, but are they fortuitous, or were you just like, wow, I'm so glad I did this because of XYZ?
Okay, now we're back.
Cool.
Okay.
You got it.
I'm going to answer the question. You let me know if I didn't get it totally. You know, I think another thing I did right, and this started in college, is like allowing myself to follow what I was truly interested in. And I realized that some of that is a privilege. to have parents that, were not forcing me into something. But so I'm in college, I majored in psychology and I double minored in Spanish and African American studies. And the way that those minors came about is like, I literally looked up senior year and was like, oh, I have enough credit. I just have to take like 2 more classes for these minors. Sure. Right. So I would just like look through the course catalog. And back then we had a catalog and be like, this looks interesting. That looks interesting. This looks interesting. I'll take it. So I think allowing myself the space to just pursue my interest, do the things that I wanted to do, like focusing on the things that light me up and then the things that I felt like I wanted to contribute. So I would say that is the thing I did right. I think leaving a job that I thought would be my dream job, like it had all the titles and the status and all of those things, but really was not a good fit for me. Leaving that and taking a leap into entrepreneurship is something that I did right. And I'm proud of myself for taking that courageous step, building relationships and community and sharing with friends and family about my challenges, like the things that are going well. And then also sharing kind of authentically online about those things. I think those are some of the things that I've done well.
When you think about how all of this and all of your experience comes to you like right now and what you're doing. I love what you said before about you're making more money and feeling better with doing less because you found that space, and doing those things. Are there anything that you're really excited for going forward, like things that you're working on now or things that you have coming up? Like what are you excited for next to take all of these things to get to the next level?
That's a good question. So I'm in an interesting space right now where I'm kind of like, all right, like things are maintaining, but I have the feeling that there are bigger things to come, but they're not here yet. And they may not be here for a couple of years. Like we'll see. So I think I'm like excited about like what is to come. Like I want to write a book that, reaches lots and lots of people. I don't think that now is the time to do that for me, but I'm excited about that. I'm excited about the day-to-day work that I get to do with helping people tap into their strengths and their gifts and, show up and thrive. Like I love doing that. I'm always excited about more speaking opportunities. So I don't know if I have like anything big brewing right now. But I do feel like I'm where I'm meant to be. And I do also feel like there are bigger things coming. It's just kind of a matter of when. And so I'm in sort of like a preparation phase of like, like strengthen your muscles, like get ready, make sure you're doing really good work with what you're doing now so that you're ready when whatever is supposed to come, whatever meant to come will come.
Well, everything that I've seen in your, from what I've heard so far and speaking with you, and I mean, whatever it is and what you're doing, you're going to show up as your full self and you got it because it's been really impressive to see, everything that you've put together so far. So that's why I'm so excited to be able to pick your brain and share some of this. I want to also talk about people that you mentioned your parents before and seeing them as a model. Are there any other people that in your experience that you either came across your path that you looked at as mentors or point the way for you in any type of manner?
That's a good one.
You don't have to name names.
Yeah.
if you want.
I have not been someone who like has like, I know people who are like, I have a mentor. This is my mentor. They're my like we check in. I have never had that. And I think maybe some of it is because I've had my parents and for a while I sort of roughly followed their sort of academic path. And so they really knew a lot of like what I was going through, what I needed to do. And so I think they served as mentors. I would say, I think there are people who serve as like models of possibility for me, right? So I may not know them, but the way that they have created impact and created success beyond some more traditional boundaries is really inspiring me. So I think of Nedra Tawwab, who wrote, she's like a boundaries expert and wrote for the New York Times and has best-selling books and, has a therapy practice and does all of these things. I think of, Brene Brown, who's also, in the mental health field, who's like broken out. So I think there are people, Oprah's like an ultimate model of possibility, but I think there are people who remind me or show me like, okay, it's okay to do something different than the norm, right? Like you don't have to be confined to this one way of creating success as a psychologist or as a mental health professional. And so not that I'm like, oh, I want to follow their exact path, but feeling like, okay, there are ways to impact the world and create what I want to create in the world that don't have to fit into this narrow box or boundaries.
I love that answer. And one of the things that I feel like in my experience that I've realized is sometimes, having that, well, I'll call it inspiration in a person, or sometimes it can come from a lot of places. It can be a person or a real person, or sometimes even fictional characters. I can see like it just gives you that inspiration of like, oh, that's possible, or that's a thing, or maybe I should try that, or at least explore this over there. And the names that you mentioned, I mean, those are big, those are heavy hitters there.
Yes.
Have you ever talked to any of those people or reached out to them?
I have not talked to any of those people.
Well, hey, that's a practice that I would put up. I had I'll say it. I don't think I've ever talked about this. I sent years ago Barack Obama an email just saying, inspiring, like what he was doing and just said that, and I got a message back, and it like
awesome.
Like, just I was like, man, that's cool. And I don't know if it's really him or it could have been someone in the staff, whatever. I don't care. It was like, but sometimes sharing what you feel and that you find importance in what somebody's doing can be very meaningful. It was a meaningful practice for me just sending out, even if I never got a response.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a good point. And I appreciate when people email me and are like, oh, I really appreciated this. But then I'm always like, people, they don't need. But my running joke is that so I don't schedule meetings before 10 a.m. because I need a slow morning. But I always joke that well, if Oprah calls,
yeah, that's funny.
Then I would schedule a meeting at 8 or 9 a.m.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, it's probably not happening.
You'll make an exception.
Yes.
So as far as that, okay, so let's go back to some techniques. You mentioned you don't have meetings before 10 o'clock. I like that a lot. Are there any other things that you have set up in your schedule that you're like, okay, I don't do this, I don't work on this day, or I exercise? Like, what are some other things that you put in your life as boundaries, I guess?
Exactly. So, I'm up usually around 5:30, 5:45 because I have a toddler who generally wakes up at 6:30 and but it's like, okay, I wake up, I work out, I either meditate before I get her up or a little bit later in the morning, but I am somebody, I have learned that I am someone who really appreciates a slow morning. So even though I'm up, I do not want to be even if somebody calls me in the morning, I'm like, I do not want to talk to you. So I have learned that my morning time needs to be quiet and needs to be my own rhythm. And I'm not necessarily doing the same thing, but the building blocks that I know support my mental and physical wellness are, first of all, getting enough sleep. Second of all, working out pretty consistently, meditating, right? Those building blocks, and having a slow morning helps me so that I can ease into the day and really be ready. And every time I'm I should be able to do a 9 a.m. Then I'm always rushing and I'm can't really have breakfast. And I'm just I don't want to do it. Right. And so that's one of the things. I really limit meetings on Fridays. I'm not quite to no meetings, because I say no meetings and then that's not a boundary I'm the best at holding, but I generally don't do meetings on Friday. I end my workday at 4 or 5 p.m. typically, and I do not work in the evenings, and I also do not work on the weekends. So I have a pretty, I'm not even working 40 hours a week, right? But when I'm working, I'm focused and I'm productive and getting things done, but I'm limiting those times, and I'm not doing, there's an exception every once in a while, but I'm generally not working at night and not working on the weekends. And those things help me to show up better when I am working, so that I'm not exhausted. And that took a lot of transition because I very much used to work all the time, always have a laptop in my lap, all that stuff. But I feel much better now that I've made that shift.
One of the things you mentioned that about not working on Fridays and doing those things. I think sometimes these boundaries that we set, and I do something very similar where I don't have them planned or don't generally like them, but it leaves that space open for flexibility, for creativity, or something comes up, I'm not so bogged down. But yeah, if there's something, if Oprah calls, there will be a Friday appointment. Yeah, I know. I love that. You mentioned exercise and some other things. Do you have any hobbies that you enjoy that bring you back to your creative side or get your juices flowing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I really do enjoy cooking. So I like trying new recipes and making things. It's like a little different with a toddler because, it's just different. But I do enjoy cooking, and, my dad is a really good cook. So I feel like that's a connection to him. And so like cooking, trying new recipes, making good food, doing something with my hands is a creative outlet. I also love dancing. I have not been dancing as much. It's like I got out of the rhythm, and so I haven't, though my birthday party, which is in like a couple of weeks, a week and a half really, we're going to go to a dance class. So that's going to be a lot of fun with my girlfriend. So I would say dancing and cooking are my like creative outlets.
Got it. I love it. Okay. So before we take out, I want to be mindful of your time, and I appreciate everything that you've said. You've given a lot of context and a lot of great tips here. I want to kind of open the floor and just say, is there anything that you want to leave our listeners out? Some big takeaways or even some cute details that you want to make sure that come across?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think
it's a big one. It's a big one. If you could say anything, what would it be? There you go.
I guess if I'm sort of like pulling some of the themes from what I've shared, one is I really encourage people to shift away from trying to use accomplished external things to prove their worthiness and to start to get curious, right? Like sometimes people aren't sure, like they're not like, I don't think I have self-worth issues like as often, but it's like, get curious about whether you're feeling unfulfilled, whether you're just pursuing achievement, accomplishment after accomplishment after accomplishment, and it's not giving you what you want it to give you, right? Like start to get curious about that and see if there is something to be shifted, right? Like if you are you really interested in this? Is this really what you want to do? Do you feel like your gifts are being utilized, right? So just start to reflect on that, right? Like, hopefully you don't have a situation like mine, which is like you get to this ultimate achievement and you don't feel good, right? But like that you could reflect on that. So that's one thing. And then I think the other theme is like enjoy the journey and the process. Like we are living life now. And I think often for high achievers, there's a putting off, right? Like when I do this, when I pass that exam, when I get that job, when I get that promotion, when. And the reality is that life is now and life is short, and really whatever you can do to enjoy life now, to enjoy the process of what you're doing, the process of your work, to have more fun, like I would have recommended my younger self. I think that's really what helps to make life rich and feel good. And it reinforces the fact that you're worthy of a wonderful life right now.
Unconditional worth. Thank you so much, Dr. Gooden. I love everything you're doing, and I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and our listeners.
Thanks so much for having me, Dustin. It was a joy. I appreciate all of your wonderful questions.
Oh, thank you so much.